How's it going, everybody? So in this video we are going to be breaking down overtraining syndrome, overreaching, and the entire stress recovery adaptation cycle so we can get a more clear understanding of how all of this stuff works. And hopefully this is more practical, pragmatic, and simple, easy to understand compared to all my other videos on overtraining syndrome and various subscribers that I've had that have asked me about overtraining syndrome. This one is going to just really be the be-all, end-all of overtraining videos. Okay, this will tell you everything you need to know about how to train effectively, recover effectively, and adapt effectively, and how overtraining works. Okay. So, definitely watch this entire video and subscribe to me if you haven't already. There's going to be lots of very important information on here that I've collected over the years from my own experiences, a wide variety of other leading PhD researchers in the field, as well as scientific evidence on the subject. So here we go. So, in order to understand overtraining syndrome, we first need to understand the stress recovery adaptation cycle and the fitness fatigue model of adaptation. So let's start with stress recovery adaptation. So this is a concept kind of popularized by Juggernaut Training Systems with Chad Wesley Smith, as well as Dr. Mike Israetel and Renaissance Periodization. I actually own the book that this principle was kind of first explained and detailed upon. The Scientific Principles of Strength Training by Chad Wesley Smith, Dr. James Hoffman, and Dr. Mike Israetel of Renaissance Periodization. So this principle applies across the board, and obviously it's been discussed in various other forms and called different things over the last 50 to 100 years from different textbooks like Super Training and Mel Stiff and some of these others. So Sivichansky, I can't even say these Russian names, but anyway, so stress recovery adaptation. What happens when you train, no matter what it is? You could be doing 1,000 body weight squats on a single leg. Okay. You could be doing a 100-mile marathon. You could be lifting a 5x5 back squat. Okay, strength training, right? When you put your body under a physical stress, okay, that's the stress response. It basically throws the body off of balance. It throws the body out of homeostasis. The body senses a threat to your survival. Okay, let's say you squat 100 pounds. If you're incredibly weak and 100 pounds is heavy to you, unfortunately, hopefully it's not. Your body, you lift a heavy weight on a squat, your body basically treats it as if, you're dying in the jungle and a tree trunk fell on you or something, and the body's designed to survive. So what does the body do to encourage the chances of you surviving next time the tree trunk falls on you or the 100-pound squat is on your back? Or what does your body do next time you train another 100-mile race, or you go out in the sun and you get a little sunburnt for 10 minutes or whatever? The body attempts to adapt to that stress by making that same stimulus easier. Okay, so that's the stress response is, oh my god, you just squatted 100 pounds for 100 reps. That is not something the body's dealt with before. Or you went out in the sun for 10 minutes. That's something you haven't done before. Or you did 1,000 body weight squats, like the guy in my recent case report review on, he thought he was overtrained, did 1,000 body weight squats. So that's a stress. That's a physical threat that you have not experienced before. And I would bargain to say that this goes for everything in human experience, including reading a book, and skill development. Hormesis, when you eat polyphenol molecules, the body senses it as a threat, and it upregulates its own defense mechanisms to defend against consuming that again in the future. Think about viral infections and vaccines and things like that. You get exposed to a virus and the body's like, oh God, this threat is in my body, and now it needs to develop immunity to the viral infection or whatever. So this is very fundamental response to a stress of any kind. Cold exposure, Wim Hof method, hot exposure, heat shock proteins, whatever. Okay, but in the context of this discussion, you go out and you run a mile, your body needs to adapt. Okay, that's stress. Body needs to adapt. You lift a 300-pound squat for 5 reps or whatever. Body needs to adapt. Okay, that's a stress. Now the body needs to adapt that stress so that it can better deal with it next time. So that's stress, adaptation, and now we need recovery. So recovery is it's defined in many different ways. This is actually the very shaky part of overtraining syndrome and of training adaptation in general, is that we really don't have any actual effective, tangible test to measure recovery. We can't really even define recovery. And by the metrics, people usually define recovery by, how quickly your performance goes back to baseline. So basically, after you induce a training stress, your body starts the adaptation period. You lose performance for a while. Say you do 5 sets of 5 with 300 pounds, and that was super incredibly hard. You're going to be tired. Your body breaks down muscle proteins, muscle tissue. It produces various inflammatory compounds. Serotonin increases, which gives you the feelings of fatigue. Lots of these kind of stress markers will be induced. Sometimes, we have a very short-lived decrease in testosterone and increase in cortisol, although this generally goes back to baseline relatively quickly. And so, you have performance decrements where you're not able to produce the same amount of force in the squat that you were before. Or let's say you did 1,000 body weight squats and your legs feel like jello, you can't even run or something for a couple hours or whatever. So recovery is generally defined as the time it takes for your body to go back to being able to perform again, basically. But there's a huge problem with that model of recovery, and maybe we'll go into it deeper a little bit later. But basically, this kind of gets into the fitness fatigue model, which gives us a better idea of how recovery actually works. So it is important to understand stress adaptation recovery, because that's a fundamental way of viewing stress. Typically, people who use that model also believe in supercompensation, which is not a fact of adaptation. It's since been pretty much debunked. But basically, supercompensation is an outdated idea that when you put your body under stress, your performance goes down below baseline, and then you need a couple of days of rest to recover, and then once you recover, your body overcompensates for the stress that you put it under, and basically makes your abilities far higher than they were before you trained. Now, before the training stress originally happened and the recovery process began. Now, the problem with that is that's not actually how things work. There's no first of all, there's no standardized amount of time that you need to recover. In fact, the more that you expose your body to a certain stress, the faster it can recover from that stress, and the less of a stress that stress becomes. Okay, so this is a fitness fatigue model here. You don't super compensate. Okay, your body doesn't be like, oh shit, like that was stressful, it almost killed me, and now I'm going to give you a little bit more fitness than you started with in order to deal with it. That's outdated. That's not how physiology actually works. And there is no standardized time. You'll find models in like Practical Programming for Strength Training by Mark Ripito, Leon Kilgore, and Andy Baker, where it basically says, people who are not really trained, untrained, novice athletes typically, they can recover after 48 hours, and then the more trained you are, apparently, the longer it takes for you to recover. 78 hours in the intermediate athletes, and then advanced athletes take like a whole month to recover. That is absolute nonsense. That only happens if you are training way too intensely and you don't know how to program your training effectively, basically. You basically kill yourself every workout beyond the ability to recover. But we're going to get to that here in a bit, okay? If you are pushing yourself beyond the limits to the point of what people call overtraining syndrome or whatever, if you're not recovering effectively and you really are training too hard, you will know. You will have symptoms. Typically what happens is you feel achy joints, usually joint pains. You feel kind of like injury prone, or you do develop injuries first is usually what happens. Usually you feel extremely exhausted. You have night sweats. You have insomnia. And typically they don't just like hit you randomly after, like just randomly out of nowhere, full on. Typically it's a little bit of sleep difficulty, a little bit of mood swings, a little bit of achiness and muscle pain and fatigue that builds up over time. Sometimes some of these symptoms will be pretty pronounced at first when you first start kind of reaching that threshold where you're training too hard and not recovering properly. But typically, it slowly, gradually builds up, and you see it coming, and you're overtraining. And the proper term for this is not overtraining; it's actually overreaching. Okay, so let's get into fitness fatigue model, because this kind of helps us understand all of this. So fitness fatigue is a different model than, well, I would say it's different than supercompensation, and even maybe, yeah, but it's not really, I guess. Supercompensation describes basically what we see, the symptomology of adaptation, but the physiology is different. So basically, fitness fatigue is the idea that when you train, okay, let's say you do 1,000 body weight squats on, twice a week for your leg day, right? I'm only using that example because of the recent case study that kind of triggered me to make this video. You do 1,000 body weight squats. You probably worked yourself up to that. And even if you didn't, to do 1,000 total body weight squats in one day, if you haven't already trained yourself to do that, you probably are going to break it up into sets. There's no other way. So basically, whatever. If you do 1,000 body weight squats in one day, that creates a training stress, right? Your body's like, oh crap, this is something the organism did. So basically, the body starts to groove neural pathways, okay? Neuromuscular pathways that try to make your body more efficient at that skill. So it's kind of like more of a skill development paradigm, okay? So let's say I squat 300 pounds for 5 sets of 5 at a RPE, rate of perceived exertion, of 8. Okay, that means probably could have done 2 or 3 more reps for each set, right? Whatever. I do a 5 set of 5 with 300 pounds on squat. Basically, at first that might be hard, and my body might feel pretty bad and ran down. That might have been an all-out grinder, 5 sets of 5 back squat with 300 pounds. and my body's not very efficient at adapting to that. Now, if I do if I do that same workout 2 days later, even if I'm sore and beat down. So first of all, that first exposure to that training stress makes your body starts to develop adaptations. Okay, it starts to develop fitness. Your body starts to make adjustments to adapt to that 5 sets of 5 back squat with 300 pounds. And at the same time that your body is adapting to that workout, and again, it doesn't matter what the workout is, but when you do a workout, your body is adapting to it. It creates adaptations. It's trying to make things easier. But at the same time, there's also a breakdown of muscle tissue. There is, free radical damage that is done, okay? Oxidative damage. Okay, what people call inflammation is really just cellular damage, okay? There's inflammatory byproducts that happen, cytokines and whatever, stuff like that. There's neurotransmitter changes like serotonin increasing, dopamine going down. You might have more increase in cortisol, lower testosterone, hardly even significant. But you have like stress that's happening in the body. Okay, catabolism, breakdown of muscle tissue, joint tissue, etc. You'll have a little bit of tiredness, and you might want to take a nap. Whatever, you might get hungry. So this is stress. This is damage. Okay, this is what we call fatigue. Okay, in sports science, we call this fatigue. Fatigue is really just the lingering side effects of training. It's the stress of training. It's the byproducts of the stress of training. It's the symptoms that what you just did was stressful. Okay, if you have pains from training, that's fatigue. If you feel like your muscles can't move as well as they did before the workout, that is fatigue. You feel tired, that's just fatigue. Feel depressed mood, those are side effects of fatigue or symptoms of fatigue. It's a general term. There's systemic fatigue, there's neural fatigue, what else is there? There's local fatigue, okay? Lots of different types of fatigue. Renaissance Periodization has done many great videos and complete lectures with PowerPoint slides breaking down the different types of fatigue in detail, and also fatigue management. Very, very good videos and good resource for all of this stuff that we're talking about here, even though it's more catered towards powerlifting, but it still applies to general athletic adaptation, is the scientific principles of strength training, again, by Renaissance Periodization, Juggernaut Training Systems. So anyway, yeah, so you have, what people call stress or fatigue or whatever, okay? So fitness is basically your body's adaptations, its development of skills to whatever training you put it through. 1,000 bodyweight squats in one day. At first, it's going to be, multiple sets of 25, okay, to reach the total of 1,000 squats. But then after you do 1,000 total squats in multiple sets of 25, you get better at doing sets of 25 all the way up to 1,000 bodyweight squats. So after a while, your body can do sets of 30, and then sets of 40, then sets of 50, and over time you can work yourself up to being able to do 1,000 bodyweight squats in one day in sets of 100 reps each. So your body gets way more efficient at doing the work you impose upon it. Okay? That is fitness. That is adaptation. And fatigue is the pain you get from that session. It is the inflammatory response. It is the tiredness. It is the symptoms that generally people will associate with overtraining if it's continuously done over time. That fatigue builds up over time. So now let's get into overtraining, and let's get into overreaching, and let's kind of like get into how that kind of can develop from this model. So basically, remember, supercompensation is not really how the body works. Okay, that's kind of just more of like an observation that Hans Selye made in the early 1900s. I have multiple books by him that I found randomly at Goodwill and definitely wanted to buy just for historical collective purposes. Basically, he found the stress recovery adaptation response and supercompensation in rats and model organisms, okay? But in humans, you don't have supercompensation, right? So anyway, fitness fatigue is what we're using here. So basically, here's how overtraining is supposed to happen, supposedly, right? And I'm going to get into the actual studies on overtraining and where overtraining is possible and where it's not. And I'll break down some of the evidence off the top of my head. So anyway, fitness fatigue, what happens is, so let's say you do 1,000 body weight squats and you don't really sleep very good that night and you're not eating enough protein like most people usually don't, unless, unfortunately, unless they study this enough. And let's say you also are shooting up cocaine, or I don't even know, or you're taking pre-workout or something, right? You're taking a lot of caffeine or something, right? And you're just getting amped up every single time. You're amping up your nervous system. You're, jamming out to death metal like I like to do, all of this crap except for the cocaine. I don't do drugs, just so everyone knows, but I do take caffeine. And I take tyrosine and cordyceps and pine pollen and other things. But anyway, I usually make my own pre-workout with raw ingredients because that's how you should do it if you want to save money and get the most bang for your buck and actually feel it like hardcore. Anyway, so let's say, like you just literally don't sleep much, you don't eat protein. Look, here's the interesting thing, first of all. So let's just say this. Let's just continue with what I'm saying here. Over time, let's say every single day you do 1,000 freaking body weight squats, okay? So we're not just breaking up into leg day, upper, push pull legs or whatever, okay? We're literally doing body weight squats every single day, okay? So first of all, if we want to be realistic, I'm pretty sure basically your body's going to adapt to it. It's going to make those bodyweight squats easier, especially if you do them every day. It'll feel like absolute garbage the first month or so that you do 1,000 bodyweight squats every day. Okay, you'll feel like garbage if you do it every single day. But I know professional fighters who have done routines like this. Like I personally know fighters who have done this. Okay, they've done routines like this. But it's not just I see the Muay Thai people doing this all the time, and they probably get per week, probably 2,000 bodyweight squats a week, just because they do that all the time for the first 20 or 30 minutes of their practice. I don't know why they do that, but that's what they do. Not my style of strength and conditioning, but I know it works well for building anaerobic capacity, aerobic capacity, and all sorts of things. So anyway, and they're champions, so like it's got to work, right? They constantly go and own the other teams at the Muay Thai circuit. So anyway, I know plenty of people do that, right? So let's just say you do that every single day. You do like 1,000 bodyweight squats, okay? So realistically, your body, the more that you expose your body to that stress, the easier and easier it's going to get, and the less you're going to need to recover from. And the same thing happens when you actually train strength properly, okay? For me personally, I've done the Bulgarian light method, where I work up to a max effort, like all-out grinder back squat. That's not the Bulgarian light. You're supposed to leave 2 reps in reserve. But I would go out for all-out grinder, max effort squat, and I did that every day, sometimes twice a day. There's a lot of people on YouTube who have actually done this, and for the first 4 to 6 weeks, usually just hit PRs. Like every time I do that, I add 30 to 50 or 60 pounds on my lifts. Like I've done that on bench press multiple times, I've done that on squats multiple times, and I always add 30 to 60 pounds on my squat and bench press, my pause bench, when I do that. So I don't like overtrain, like as in what people, you don't regress in performance usually. Performance usually doesn't decrease because remember, we have fitness building and then we also have fatigue building. So you can literally, you will see performance improvements while you're building up that so-called overtraining response. And you kind of have to. The only way to like reach an overtraining state is if you are continuously pushing your body beyond its previous limit. So that means your body's constantly able to push harder and harder every time. It's not that you stop adapting. It's not that your performance goes down. Now, you'll hear people say overtraining syndrome involves performance decrements. Usually you get injured pretty severely before you see strength go down and your mileage on your marathon times go down, right? Usually you get injured first. But performance doesn't start to decrease until you're really deep in a hole. Now, you'll feel aches, you'll feel pains, you'll feel muscle soreness. And usually it gets so bad that you have to take a deload week or you have to pull back a little bit. This is why clinical overtraining syndrome, like in the scientific literature, is almost always only seen in high-level endurance, like triathlons, Ironman athletes, marathon runners, endurance athletes who are running or are cycling like hundreds of miles a week, okay? And they're in an extreme caloric deficit, and they're usually drinking so much water, a lot of times they flush out the sodium. Okay, you have to be doing, and again, you'll hear this from multiple experts that so-called overtraining syndrome is not intensity dependent, it is volume dependent. And again, who is doing, what type of athletes are doing the most volume consistently? Like, we're not talking rhythm, damn it, like cyclic activities. Like cyclic meaning it's like, dribbling a basketball and then shooting the ball in a hoop for like a minute, followed by a couple seconds rest. That's a cyclic activity, like intervals, right? I think that's cyclic, whatever. Basketball, even, mixed martial arts, whatever. Like we might be training or practicing in our sport, even if it's soccer, for like 4 hours a day, right? But are you really training consistently for all of those 4 hours? Almost never. You have a little bit of high intensity activity, then a little bit of rest, then a little bit of high activity intensity, a little bit of rest, a little bit of low intensity, a little bit of moderate, but it's not consistent for a long duration. So marathon athletes and endurance runners and endurance athletes, these are the only athletes that overtraining syndrome has actually been documented, diagnosed, and you could find it on blood tests, okay? And these are the people who will have months and months where they have all these symptoms and can't recover, even years, right? These people are doing way more than this like 1,000 body weight squats, even if they're on one leg. And I think that might have been a typo. It might not have been one leg. I don't know. But in that case review that I mentioned in the last video, where a guy said he's doing 1,000 body weight squats on a leg day, so probably only twice a week, like that's not intense enough to induce overtraining. It's just not. However, think about these runners who are running hundreds of miles a week. And these endurance athletes typically don't eat a lot of protein. Usually they slam the carbs. And generally they have a pretty high rate of catabolism of protein, of lean mass. This is typically why you'll see endurance athletes who typically look really stringy, okay? But I think I made a video about why that is and how to avoid it, and why training endurance doesn't have to make you a string bean and make you lose muscle mass. But anyway, it's because your body, let's see, when we talk about like caloric, like energy partitioning and caloric partitioning, okay? And let's talk about like protein metabolism a little bit. So your body prioritizes energy in versus energy out first and foremost. So if you are running a couple hundred miles a week, your body is going to burn its stored glycogen, its glucose, its liver glycogen, and then it's going to start to catabolize fats. And if you're on a exogenous carbohydrate-based diet where you're not fully keto adapted, I know it's controversial, but I made videos talking about it. But basically, what happens when you're in that state is your body will start to eat its own protein for energy. Okay, and we're talking these endurance athletes running hundreds of miles a week, not thousands, hundreds. And they will have a lot of protein breakdown, meaning like lean muscle tissue will be broken down for energy. Now, it's not exclusively muscle protein for energy, but it's a mixture, okay? Because they're running so long, and they'll take like glucose packets and stuff, but there's only so much your body can absorb at once while it's already like, pumping blood to sustain the long 100-mile run or whatever. So what I'm getting at here is these people are at a higher need for protein intake and energy intake in general. And it's very common to see these people just kind of like catabolize muscle mass as a result of the high volumes of training they're doing. These endurance athletes are literally, you think 1,000 bodyweight squats once or twice a week with no rest days is hardcore. Think about doing, basically you're running a couple hundred miles a week. You're doing hours and hours of non-stop, consistent quarter squats over and over again. That's basically what running is. I'm not a runner, damn it, okay? But, if to put it down simply so you understand, these people are probably doing a couple thousand, like, I don't know, 100,000 quarter squats, like quarter single leg squats over and over again. I guess they're quarter lunges over and over again for hours of a sustained pace at a time. These are the people that induce overtraining syndrome, not 1,000 body weight squats once or twice a week. That's not really that crazy. So I'm just putting it out there because I have gotten so many comments from people who think they're overtraining, and they tell me their routine and it's like nothing. I'll get to other kind of crazy like experiences people have told me they've had. That's obviously not overtraining syndrome. I'll talk about that later. But let's continue on with the solid hard facts here. Okay. So anyway, if you continuously put your body in a net catabolic state over and over again, let's just say you're doing weight training super hard. Like if you just go straight into it, you do a shit ton of volume. If you do all those thousands of squats, you go from being a sedentary person who has no exercise background, and then you just start doing 1,000 squats, every single day. You're going to feel like garbage, and that fatigue will build up, and there will be there'll be a higher amount of fatigue and a lower amount of adaptation or fitness development. And that will develop what's known as overreaching. Okay, so overreaching, there is functional overreaching, which is a planned overreaching phase where you plan to go really, really hard for like the last week of your mesocycle and your programming before you deload or you do a light week. So you plan to overreach, to reach over what you're capable of doing so you can get better gains. Or non-functional overreaching, which non-functional overreaching is where you didn't intend to overshoot, to overload beyond what you're capable of, and it produces way more fatigue than is productive for that period of training. So non-functional overreaching is basically what most people who think they're overtraining actually experience. I experience this all the time because I'm a balls-to-wall type of guy. And I'll have to make a whole nother video where I talk about case reports of overtraining and stuff, but and maybe examples of what overtraining is and what it's not. But believe me when I say I've gone through some really just ridiculous like training routines that are so over the top compared to all these other people that keep telling me they're overtraining when they're really not, okay? And also, if you think you're overtraining and you experience these symptoms, especially if they hit you like a ton of bricks out of nowhere, and you're not really, doing the kind of caliber of volume, the volume of training, okay, the overall total volume of training that these endurance athletes are doing, and you think you're overtraining, you have these symptoms out of nowhere, it's important that you go and get a checked, that you get thoroughly checked, okay? You get tested for viral infections and things like that, and nutrient deficiencies. And I've had a client who was bedridden for 10 years, and it seems like he just was lacking in a vitamin. I think he was lacking in vitamin A. He said he started eating liver and more meat, and then he did NoFap, and now he's not bedridden anymore, and he could work. I think that he actually probably had a vitamin A deficiency, and eating liver helped. But anyway, and just as a side note, beta-carotene is not sufficient for that purpose, unfortunately, no matter how much vegans will tell you that it is. So let's see. So yeah, you keep doing those 1,000 bodyweight squats over time. You don't eat enough protein, and your body's going to be basically eating up more lean mass than it can replenish. So you have muscle protein breakdown without enough replenishment, without enough protein coming in from food, and you start to develop a net catabolism. So you're developing more fatigue and more breakdown without enough nutrition to support that growth. Okay. Now, if you ate a very high protein diet, like most studies suggest, anywhere from 1.7 grams per pound of body weight, 1.7 grams per kilogram of body weight to about 3.4 grams per kilogram of body weight, which translates to about 1 to 2.5 grams of protein per pound of lean mass, really, not body weight, lean mass. Okay, that's how much you need to support growth. I would say, to be on the safe end, 1 gram of protein, 1.5 grams of protein per pound of lean mass, okay? Because lean mass is, whatever. Or 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight is probably a good minimum. Ideal body weight is good. I use that for my fighters. We do grams per pound of their weight class, but when they're cutting. Anyway, and most fighters basically try to starve themselves leading up into camp. And that's a whole other story. That's a good example of how crazy the body can adapt to things and not die, basically. Because I guarantee you're not under the same kind of metabolic stress doing 1,000 bodyweight squats every couple days compared to fighters getting ready for a camp. That shit's just crazy. Anyway, so yeah, you keep building up the stress, and it has to be a high amount of stress. It's just like absolutely absurd amount of punishment you put your body through every day in order to get that overtraining syndrome. Okay, so again, it's usually going to be, competitive fighters, maybe, right, when they're restricting their caloric intake and restricting their food intake and basically starving themselves. So these marathon athletes, another reason why why they're more prone to overtraining syndrome, and why they're the only documented athletes that seem to actually even get overtraining syndrome on a clinical level, is mostly because they, in order to run for as long as they do at the speed that they do, there's a common kind of belief amongst marathon runners that the lighter they are, the better they'll perform in these endurance events. So there's a lot of kind of like aim to be as small as possible, to weigh as low as possible. So these people a lot of times will purposely restrict themselves, okay? And I don't want to get too deep in this, but there's a lot of like eating disorders and a lot of things that go on in these communities. And there isn't all communities, but just hear me out. And on top of the restriction of food intake and things to get super light to improve performance, these people also are doing the highest amounts of volume out of any other athlete on the planet, okay? If you don't know what volume is, you need to look it up, okay? It's easy to explain volume in terms of strength training and whatnot. It's just reps times sets times frequency, basically. Not times weight. That would be tonnage. People get that wrong pretty often. But volume would be, for marathon runners, like the amount of mileage, over the course of the week, maybe, probably times the pace, equate the pace in there, the overall RPE, and, whatever. So I don't know. I'm not an endurance athlete, but they do the highest amount of volume of training, the most amount of consistent, nonstop, over and over again, like physical overload training. And that is why, combined with the basically starvation diet to perform better, that's why these people experience overtraining syndrome in clinical studies, but we don't see it in other populations, okay? Not to say it doesn't exist in other populations. So let's get to the evidence here, okay? So we have multiple meta-analysis of different athlete populations and studies surveying overtraining syndrome on a clinical level. And I would say this would be defined as a crash cortisol to testosterone ratio, and these crazy symptoms that build up over time, night sweats, rhabdomyolysis is a huge one. Rhabdo is a clear sign that you've pushed too far. And you will see that on a urinalysis. It is a health crisis, and you will be seeking medical attention ASAP. But yeah, like insomnia, mood swings, aggression, anxiety, extreme muscle pains that just don't go away with rest and proper nutrition, which most people don't know how to fuel themselves properly, unfortunately, or they think they do. What else? Joint, connective tissue aches and pains. Libido completely goes away. Appetite's a big one. Appetite completely goes away, yada yada. But these are the symptoms, right? But the big thing here is, even when they're fed adequate protein, and they have a complete cessation from all training, these symptoms don't go away completely. Now, that is generally the symptomology of overtraining syndrome. But usually they have a test, testosterone to cortisol ratio, and you can see higher cortisol, lower testosterone. And that's, side note, that's one of the main reasons why, taking testosterone typically is one of the main, performance enhancing drugs most athletes take. But anyway, so yeah. So another thing is that, there's a lot of, kind of metrics people try to use to diagnose overtraining syndrome. So you have heart rate variability, and I was on the heart rate variability train for a while. I had a Whoop and everything. But that is really not reliable to determine training readiness. It really tends to nocebo people into not training when their Whoop tells them not to train. Like, the heart rate variability goes crazy, which can actually induce the very patterns of recovery that the Whoop is telling them to do. Because if you don't train on a day where you feel like shit, or if you don't train on a day where your Whoop tells you not to train, you don't get the adaptation that comes with training that day. And so it'll kind of mold itself in the ebbs and flows based on nocebo effect. But anyway, basically the vast majority of scientific evidence on heart rate variability show that is a very poor and inconsistent tool to use to determine training readiness and recovery, and how recovered you are in any given day. And a little side note, rate of perceived exertion tends to be one of the most effective tools for determining training readiness, especially in advanced athletes. However, there's also problems with that. So what else? So you have testosterone to cortisol ratio, but typically it goes back to baseline after a couple weeks, except for in these clinically overtrained marathon athletes. And then you have symptomology and whatnot. So, we don't really have a clear definition of overtraining syndrome outside of the endurance athlete example, in the crash cortisol testosterone ratio, which most people don't have. So now let's talk about some of the other studies on overtraining, okay? So there was a study, I think it was by Kramer et al., where basically, don't quote me on this, I believe it was like a hack squat to failure group, or no, it was like a 1 rep max, like hack squat every single day. And they compared it to like equated volume or something like that, hack squat with like 3 sets of 8 or something like that. And they equated the volume. I don't remember exactly how the study was done. But they had one group who basically worked up to a max on hack squat every single day. And I think it was like a 10-week study. And basically they compared symptomology and signs of overtraining and performance outcomes. And what they showed is there was no difference between the regular training program group who equated volume on the hack squats compared to the 1 rep max every single day hack squat group. So they had pretty much identical gains. However, in some of the subjects in the 1 rep max group who trained to failure every single day, sometimes multiple times a day, some of those subjects in that study actually had a drastic improvement in their 1 rep max on hack squat, which is to be expected because, well, the more you do a given training modality, the better your body gets at it. That's adaptation. That's fitness fatigue 101. They didn't have any signs of like overtraining syndrome in this group, and some of them got better. Okay, so you have that. Then you have there was a study done out of Glenn Penley's gym, actually, and I think it might have been unpublished, but basically Glenn Penley took a sample of his lifters, and basically they did a strict Bulgarian method style of training where they were working up to maxes on squat and clean and jerk, snatch, and they were just maxing out every day, multiple times a day. And I believe that was like a 12-week study or something like that, or I don't remember, or it was multiple months. I think it kept going on for a couple years. Eventually, I think some of their gym adapted kind of like a Bulgarian-esque training style actually after it. But John Brose was really like the one who kind of took that and ran with it, you know, in America at least. But anyway, Glenn Penley, so he did this kind of like experiment with his lifters, and basically what they found is performance kept going up and up and up for about the first like 8 weeks or so to a significant degree. And I think it was after like 12 weeks or something in the study, they had like a pretty significant decrease in overall sense of well-being. They had all the symptoms of overtraining basically. They had the insomnia, the lack of appetite, they didn't want to train, like the motivation to train was gone, libido was done. And they actually did hormone panels, and they found that they had a significantly crashed testosterone to cortisol ratio. So they had basically the hormonal profile of a clinically overtrained endurance athlete. Their testosterone cortisol ratio was verifiably crashed, and they had all the symptoms. They felt like garbage, and performance started to go down for that brief period of time. Now, the interesting thing is in this study on Glenn Penley's lifters, where they were training hard as shit every day, training to failure, max attempts multiple times a day, every day, for over 12 weeks, what they found is after about 1 to 2 weeks of complete rest, I'm talking close as hell to this microphone, I apologize, guys. 1 to 2 weeks of complete rest, the testosterone to cortisol ratio went completely back to baseline. Okay? So the hormonal profile, that is pretty much the only thing we have to recognize overtraining syndrome, went completely back to baseline after 2 weeks. And when they started to kind of ease themselves back up into training, they were performing good as new once again, okay? So, and just kind of to bring this little point a little bit further, pretty much what you see in lifters like John Bros, for example, in his gym, say what you will about his athletes, but when you go through with a protocol like that, which again I don't think is the most effective or efficient way to train, and unless it's your whole life or whatever. Even then, I don't think I train that way, but after a while, you go through like a couple months, what they call the dark times, where you have these hormone crashes that Glenn Penley's lifters found out about. If you just keep pushing through it and keep maxing out through all the pain and suffering, you come out on the other end, and basically they claim that your adrenal glands like super compensate, and you become the super warrior athlete that just starts hitting crazy amounts of PRs over and over again. So anyway, these are some of the best evidence that we have on getting as close as we can to overtraining syndrome and what happens in different types of athletes. So the meta-analysis and some of the studies on endurance athletes, what they find is typically you have to reach a pretty significant threshold, generally it's in endurance athletes that are preparing for a competition. Their mileages and their volume of training is going up and up and up. And they're dieting down and basically trying to get themselves in peak athletic performance for, crazy amounts of endurance, a crazy endurance event. And so during training, they're doing more volume than they've ever done before. They're restricting their food intake typically. It's usually almost always in competition prep for endurance athletes. And they find everything from rhabdomyolysis. If you don't know what that is, search it up. Serious medical problem. You will see it in medical tests. They have, it's basically just a complete, net catabolic loss of protein. Just excruciating fatigue, and performance will go down. Like they can't even get up a lot of times out of bed because their heart is so overtaxed, basically. So, and so that's like real overtraining syndrome. Now, if you're just lifting weights, okay, so I'm going to make a whole nother video where I go into examples of people who say they're overtraining versus people who actually are, and I'll go over my experiences and some of the other people's experiences that they say, and some of the people I know that have pushed the boundaries and stuff. And we'll talk more about it that way. But when we're talking about the scientific literature, okay, anyone who's actually studied this will tell you in resistance training there's almost zero evidence of that overtraining syndrome even exists. In strength training and weightlifting, even when you're doing crazy Bulgarian method type shit, after 2 weeks of a complete deload, performance goes back to baseline, and testosterone to cortisol ratio goes back to baseline. I guarantee you most of y'all are not training as hard as Glenn Penley's lifters were in that study. So 2 weeks it takes to get back to normal. That's not overtraining syndrome. That's not a huge problem, okay? But these marathon athletes, it takes them months, some of them years to go back to baseline, usually because they have such a net catabolic loss of muscle tissue, the heart's a muscle. They probably have caused damage to their organ systems, especially if they develop rhabdo, okay? And it's you can have these symptoms, night sweats, even things like muscle pains and stuff that don't go away. It could easily be something else, but it's probably not permanent organ damage. Keep that in mind. So anyway, and this is all nuance, and there's a lot of moving parts to this topic, and some of these things I talked about, there's a lot more context that needs to be kind of brought up. But to give you an overarching kind of view of this stuff, that's pretty much what we'll kind of end it at. So, again, I'm going to make another video where I go into more examples and case reports and stuff. But this is kind of the science behind it. This is the mechanisms of action, the kind of working models we use for stress recovery, adaptation, and fitness fatigue. But basically, and then these are the actual evidence we have on populations of people who have basically gone as close as they could, as any population studied, to overtraining syndrome. And when it comes to things like strength training, let's say not even on the max effort side of things like Glenn Penley's lifters, what we find is the more frequently you train, the better you get, as long as you are kind of leaving a couple reps in reserve on each set. And the main thing y'all need to take away from this is, provided you don't hurt yourself when you train, the more often you do a certain thing, you walk a mile, you run 100 miles, right? If you work yourself up, especially to being able to do these things, the more you do something, the better your body gets at doing it, and the less time you need to recover. Okay, the actual way that adaptation works is, the more trained you become at something, the less and less recovery you need. Now, you'll hear a lot of people like Steffi Cohen and some of these high-level power lifters who will say, the more trained you get, the heavier weight you lift, the more of a stress it is to your body, so the longer you need to recover. Well, these people have a really shit-ass work capacity. Now, provided they're all way better than me at way stronger than me and stuff, but they basically go into the gym and they hit these max effort sets and they kill their body with these super hardcore lifting workouts to the point where they're not able to reach that same kind of overload with weight training for another 2 weeks or so, because they think they have to go super hard every time to create an adaptation. So just so we know, in the context of overtraining, they could go in again the next day and try to hit heavy weights and stuff. They're not going to overtrain per se, but their body's just not going to allow them to repeat that same threshold of effort over and over again. So their body's not even going to let them get to that point of so-called overtraining. Now, if they try to force it, they're going to injure themselves. They're not going to reach the 5 months of doom of overtraining syndrome you see in clinical endurance athletes. But what I'm trying to get here is these powerlifters that completely destroy their body and then think they need 14 days of recovery just because they think they're so strong. There's plenty of all the highest level USAPL lifters and IPF now, because they separated. Basically, the majority of them use top single at 8 and then back down sets at a sub-maximal intensity, and they usually train at a high frequency. They bench press 4 times a week, sometimes more, squat 3 to 5 times a week, and deadlift maybe 2 to 3 times a week, or do variations. So they're lifting pretty freaking heavy. It's just they don't kill themselves with maximal effort and intensities all the time. So it's just because you're training hardcore, there's a way to do it without needing all that recovery. And anyway, I'll make other videos about this, okay? But you're probably not overtraining, okay? Hopefully this has helped. Leave your question, comments down below, and I'll talk to y'all next time.